Have you ever reached a point where it finally felt like your financial life was beginning to settle down, only to look back a few months later and wonder how you somehow ended up fighting the exact same battles all over again? It's one of the most frustrating feelings people rarely talk about because it doesn't feel like a dramatic collapse or a catastrophic mistake, but instead like a quiet reset that slowly erases months of effort without you even noticing. You pay off a few bills, your savings begin to grow, the constant stress starts to fade, and for a brief moment, you genuinely believe you finally escaped the cycle that kept pulling you backward for years. Then, life does what life always seems to do, bringing an unexpected expense, a difficult month, or a situation you never planned for. And suddenly, all of that progress disappears faster than it ever seemed to arrive. After experiencing this enough times, you stop feeling surprised and start asking yourself a much deeper question, because it becomes difficult to believe that the same thing can keep happening without there being some hidden reason behind it. Daniel had been asking himself that question for years, not because he was irresponsible with money, but because every time he thought he was finally moving forward, life somehow found a way to place him back at the beginning again. Unlike the stories you usually hear, Daniel wasn't chasing expensive lifestyles or buying things he couldn't afford, because his biggest goal was surprisingly simple. He just wanted to stop feeling like every year started from zero. He worked full-time, accepted overtime whenever it was available, turned down purchases he didn't truly need, and quietly believed that enough discipline and enough patience would eventually create the financial stability he had always imagined. Little by little, his checking account stopped feeling like a source of anxiety. His savings slowly began to grow, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe this time would finally be different. He wasn't becoming wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but that didn't matter, because what gave him hope wasn't the amount of money he had saved. It was the feeling that his life was finally beginning to move forward. That feeling lasted until one ordinary afternoon when his car started making a strange noise, and within days, he found himself holding a repair estimate large enough to erase nearly everything he had patiently built over the previous months. Paying the bill wasn't really the painful part, because he understood that emergencies happen to everyone. What hurt was watching months of careful decisions disappear in a matter of minutes, as though none of his effort had actually changed anything. Instead of giving up, Daniel did what he had always done by taking a deep breath, returning to work, rebuilding his savings dollar by dollar, and convincing himself that this setback was simply another obstacle on the road to stability. Several months later, just as his confidence began returning, another unexpected expense arrived, and the strange part wasn't that it happened at all. It was how familiar the entire experience felt, almost as if he had already lived it before. That evening, Daniel sat quietly at his kitchen table, looking back over the last several years, and realized something he had never noticed before. The individual problems kept changing, but the ending of the story somehow always stayed exactly the same. Before we continue, welcome to Lyon Invests. This channel isn't about getting rich overnight, it's about questioning the financial beliefs that quietly shape the way we earn, spend, save, invest, and build wealth. Because many of the ideas we've accepted about money sound true until we take a closer look. And once you understand the hidden patterns behind financial decisions, you start seeing money differently. If that's the kind of thinking you're looking for, I'd love to have you subscribe. Every video on this channel is designed to challenge assumptions, explore financial psychology, and uncover the invisible systems that influence the choices we make every day. One quick note before we continue. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm simply someone who's passionate about researching financial psychology, behavioral economics, investing, and the beliefs that shape how people think about money. Everything on this channel is shared for educational purposes to help you think more critically and make more informed financial decisions. Now, let's take a closer look at what this story is really revealing. When Daniel replayed those years in his mind, he realized that no single setback had been large enough to explain why he always seemed to end up back at the beginning, which forced him to consider the possibility that he had been fighting the wrong problem all along. If Daniel wasn't wasting money, wasn't making reckless decisions, and wasn't avoiding hard work, then why did every recovery eventually become another fresh start? And why does that same invisible pattern quietly shape the financial lives of millions of people every single year? The easiest answer would have been to blame bad luck, but Daniel couldn't accept that explanation, because luck might explain one setback or even two. Yet, it couldn't explain why the same ending had quietly repeated itself for nearly a decade. As he looked more carefully at his own financial history, he noticed something surprising. Every setback seemed different on the surface, but each one produced exactly the same result, which meant the real problem had to exist somewhere beneath the events themselves. Most people believe starting over financially begins with a major mistake, but Daniel's story suggested something far more unsettling, because none of his setbacks were extraordinary, and yet together they created a life that constantly felt as though it was resetting itself. That realization changed the question completely, because instead of asking why unexpected expenses kept happening, Daniel began asking why ordinary events had the power to erase nearly all of the progress he worked so hard to create. Imagine climbing a staircase where every few steps one of the stairs quietly disappears behind you, forcing you to climb back down before you can continue upward, no matter how determined or disciplined you happen to be. From a distance, it looks as though you're making progress because you keep climbing, but from your own perspective, it feels exhausting because every small victory eventually turns into another journey back toward the same starting point. Daniel slowly realized his financial life looked remarkably similar because he wasn't failing to move forward. He was repeatedly losing the ground he had already spent months trying to gain. The strange part was that nobody had ever warned him about this possibility because most financial advice focused on earning more, spending less, or investing wisely, while almost nobody talked about why progress itself can be so fragile. For years, Daniel believed that stability meant reaching a certain number in his savings account, but experience kept teaching him that a number by itself couldn't protect him from repeatedly beginning the same financial journey all over again. Every time he rebuilt his savings, he felt relieved because the immediate crisis had passed, yet relief quietly convinced him the underlying problem had disappeared, even though it had never actually been solved. That's what made the cycle so difficult to recognize, because recovery feels like success, and when something feels like success, very few people stop long enough to question whether they're simply recovering or genuinely moving forward. Without realizing it, Daniel had spent years celebrating recoveries instead of measuring lasting progress, which meant every financial comeback felt meaningful until the next ordinary setback quietly revealed how little had actually changed. Picture someone filling a bucket with water every single day, feeling encouraged as the level slowly rises, while never noticing the tiny crack near the bottom that allows the water to leak away just as steadily. The person isn't failing because they stopped pouring water into the bucket, and they aren't failing because they lack discipline. They're failing because they never discovered the hidden reason the bucket could never stay full. Daniel's financial life began to resemble that bucket because every paycheck added something valuable. Every careful decision created progress, and yet the results never seemed to remain long enough to permanently change his situation. Once he saw the pattern, he realized that every emergency wasn't actually creating the problem, because the emergencies were simply exposing a financial foundation that had never become strong enough to absorb ordinary shocks. That idea was uncomfortable because it challenged something he had believed for years, namely that working harder automatically created greater security, when in reality, hard work alone couldn't explain why the cycle always repeated itself. Perhaps the reason so many people feel trapped isn't because they refuse to move forward, but because every setback quietly demands that they spend their energy rebuilding yesterday instead of creating tomorrow. Seen through that perspective, constantly starting over isn't really a motivation problem, or even an effort problem. It's the exhausting experience of using today's income to recover from yesterday before tomorrow ever has a chance to begin. The more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized the real mystery wasn't why life kept knocking him down, but why every recovery seemed designed to return him to the exact same place instead of carrying him even one step further forward. The more Daniel reflected on those years, the more he realized he had been measuring success by the wrong standard, because every time he escaped an immediate crisis, he assumed he had made progress, when in reality, he had often only returned to where he had been before. That difference sounds small at first, but it completely changes the way you see money, because recovering from a setback and moving beyond it are not the same achievement, even though they can feel almost identical in the moment. Imagine a runner who begins every race 20 steps behind the starting line, spends all of their energy catching up to everyone else, and finishes each day feeling exhausted without ever realizing they never actually reached the place where the race truly began. Financially, many people experience something remarkably similar because so much of their income is quietly spent. Repairing yesterday's problems, that very little remains available to build tomorrow's opportunities. Daniel wasn't using each paycheck to create a stronger future as often as he believed. More frequently, he was using today's earnings to erase yesterday's losses, and those are two completely different financial experiences. That's why every raise, bonus, or tax refund seemed to disappear so quickly, not because the money lacked value, but because it arrived carrying responsibilities that had been quietly waiting long before it ever reached his account. Without noticing it, Daniel had begun treating financial stability like a destination he would eventually arrive at, when the reality was that stability behaves much more like a structure that must be built gradually beneath your everyday life. If that structure remains fragile, then every unexpected expense doesn't simply cost money. It removes part of the foundation you've been standing on, forcing you to spend months rebuilding ground you thought had already become permanent. Looking back, Daniel couldn't identify a single year that completely changed his financial direction, because each year contained the same familiar rhythm of progress, interruption, recovery, relief, and then another interruption waiting quietly around the corner. Once he recognized that rhythm, something unexpected happened because he stopped seeing his financial history as a collection of isolated events and began seeing it as one continuous pattern repeating under different circumstances. That realization raised an even more uncomfortable question, because if the pattern kept repeating regardless of the specific setback, then perhaps the setbacks themselves had never been the true cause of his financial frustration. It's easy to blame the repair bill, the medical expense, or the broken appliance because those moments are visible, but visible events often distract us from the invisible patterns that quietly determine how much damage those events are actually able to cause. Two people can experience the exact same unexpected expense, yet one sees it as an inconvenience, while the other feels as though months or even years of progress have suddenly disappeared, and that difference rarely begins with the expense itself. Daniel slowly understood that the real question wasn't why emergencies happen, because no one escapes life's unpredictability. The deeper question was why some financial lives absorb those moments while others seem to reset every single time. Picture two identical bridges crossing the same river, where one remains standing after every storm, while the other develops new cracks each time the water rises, not because the storms are different, but because the strength beneath them is completely different. Financial setbacks work much the same way because they don't create the hidden weaknesses already present beneath the surface. They simply reveal them in ways that become impossible to ignore once the pressure finally arrives. For years, Daniel had believed his biggest challenge was earning enough money, but now he began wondering whether his real challenge had been spending so much of his financial energy rebuilding that he never had the chance to truly move beyond survival. That thought lingered with him because it explained something he had never been able to understand before. Why working harder always made life feel temporarily better without ever making it feel permanently different. Perhaps the feeling of constantly starting over isn't created by one dramatic failure at all, but by countless ordinary moments that quietly consume tomorrow's progress before tomorrow ever has the opportunity to arrive. And once Daniel began seeing his financial life through that lens, he realized he had spent years trying to solve the visible problems in front of him while overlooking the invisible pattern that had been quietly repeating behind every single one of them. The more Daniel understood the pattern, the more he realized that constantly starting over financially wasn't the result of one terrible decision, but the accumulation of countless ordinary moments that quietly prevented him from ever building lasting momentum. Momentum is easy to overlook because you can't see it sitting in a bank account, yet it may be one of the most valuable financial assets a person can possess since it allows today's progress to continue carrying you forward tomorrow. Every time Daniel rebuilt his savings after an emergency, he believed he had regained momentum, but in reality, he had often only restored the position he occupied before the setback, leaving true forward movement postponed once again. Imagine trying to push a heavy boulder up a hill while someone quietly rolls it halfway back down every few weeks, because even though you continue making progress, much of your effort is repeatedly spent reclaiming ground you already earned. From the outside, people watching would probably admire your persistence because they see how hard you're pushing, but they might never notice how much of your strength is being consumed simply maintaining your position instead of advancing beyond it. That image stayed with Daniel because it perfectly described how his financial life had felt for years, as though enormous effort was producing surprisingly little permanent change, despite the fact that he rarely stopped trying. Perhaps that's why so many hard-working people eventually become discouraged, not because effort doesn't matter, but because repeating the same recovery over and over can slowly convince anyone that progress itself is impossible. The danger of that belief is that it quietly changes the way you see yourself, because after enough financial resets, you stop questioning the cycle and begin questioning your own ability, even when the evidence suggests something entirely different. Daniel had reached that point more than once, wondering whether he simply wasn't disciplined enough, wasn't intelligent enough, or wasn't earning enough, never realizing that he was blaming himself for a pattern he had never actually understood. It's remarkable how often we assume repeated outcomes must reflect repeated personal failures, even though the same outcome can just as easily be created by an invisible system quietly producing the same result again and again. Think about standing on a moving walkway that's slowly carrying you backward while you continue walking forward, because although you're making real effort with every step, your actual position changes far less than you expected. Eventually, frustration sets in because your experience tells you that hard work should create visible progress, yet your reality keeps showing something very different, making it difficult to trust that your effort is accomplishing anything meaningful. Daniel's financial journey began making sense once he imagined that moving walkway, because he finally understood why years of honest effort had often resulted in nothing more than another opportunity to begin climbing all over again. The resets themselves had quietly become part of his financial routine, appearing so regularly that they no longer felt unusual, which made the cycle even harder to recognize because familiar patterns rarely attract our attention. When something repeats often enough, the human mind begins accepting it as normal, and once something feels normal, we stop asking whether it should exist in the first place. That may be one of the most powerful reasons people remain trapped in financial cycles for years, because familiarity has an incredible ability to disguise problems that would seem obvious if we experience them for the first time. Daniel no longer saw his setbacks as isolated disappointments, because they had become pieces of a much larger picture, one that revealed a repeating cycle instead of a collection of unrelated financial accidents. For the first time, he wasn't asking how quickly he could recover from the next setback, because a far more important question had begun taking shape in his mind. Why did recovery always seem to be the goal instead of lasting progress? That single question quietly changed everything, because it shifted his attention away from the emergencies themselves and toward the invisible pattern that kept transforming temporary obstacles into permanent repetitions. And perhaps that's the most important realization so far, because once you stop seeing your financial life as a series of random setbacks and begin seeing it as a repeating pattern, you finally have the chance to understand what has actually been holding you back all along. Once Daniel stopped obsessing over each individual setback, he noticed something he had completely overlooked before. The real story of his finances had never been written by the emergencies themselves, but by what those emergencies repeatedly forced him to sacrifice. Every unexpected expense demanded more than money because it quietly stole time, delayed future plans, postponed new opportunities, and required him to rebuild confidence that had taken months to create, but only moments to lose. That explained why constantly starting over felt so emotionally exhausting, because he wasn't simply replacing dollars in a savings account. He was repeatedly trying to recreate the feeling that his life was finally moving in the right direction. The emotional cost of beginning again is rarely included in financial conversations, yet anyone who has rebuilt after setback understands that losing momentum often hurts far more than losing the money itself. Looking back, Daniel realized he had mistaken survival for progress because every recovery felt like moving forward, even though most of his energy had actually been spent returning to where he had already been before. That distinction changed everything, because surviving a financial setback is undeniably important, but surviving alone doesn't create lasting progress if every recovery simply restores yesterday instead of building tomorrow. Imagine reading the same chapter of a book every single night because someone quietly removes your bookmark before you return, leaving you feeling as though you've spent years reading without ever getting closer to the ending. Financially, constantly starting over creates the same quiet frustration because each new beginning feels productive in the moment, while the larger story remains almost unchanged despite all the effort invested in rewriting it. Daniel finally understood why his hard work had always felt strangely incomplete, because effort was never the missing piece. Lasting progress required protecting the ground he had already gained instead of endlessly reclaiming it. That realization didn't magically eliminate future emergencies, but it completely changed the way he interpreted them, because he no longer saw each setback as an isolated failure, but as another opportunity to understand the pattern more clearly. Perhaps this is why so many people believe they're falling behind, when, in reality, they're spending years running the same financial lap over and over again, never realizing the finish line keeps moving back to the beginning. When you only focus on today's setback, it feels like an unfortunate moment, but when you step back and look at several years together, the invisible cycle becomes impossible to ignore. The surprising truth is that most people don't remember every bill, repair, or emergency they faced, but they never forget the lingering feeling that no matter how hard they tried, they somehow always ended up starting over. That feeling isn't created by one expensive month or one difficult decision. It's created by watching progress disappear so many times that beginning again slowly starts to feel like the normal way financial life is supposed to work. But normal doesn't always mean inevitable, because the moment you recognize a repeating pattern, you stop seeing your financial story as a collection of random events and begin understanding that every repeated outcome has a deeper explanation. Daniel's greatest breakthrough wasn't discovering a secret investment, a perfect budget, or a higher-paying job. It was realizing that he had finally stopped asking the wrong question about why he always seemed to end up back at the beginning. Instead of asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" he began asking, "What invisible pattern keeps turning ordinary setbacks into complete financial resets?" And that single shift completely changed the way he understood his own story. Sometimes the biggest financial breakthrough doesn't begin with earning another dollar, because it begins with recognizing the hidden cycle you've been living inside, a cycle that quietly shapes your future until you finally learn to see it. The people who eventually move beyond constantly starting over aren't necessarily the ones who experience fewer setbacks, but the ones who recognize that lasting progress depends on understanding the pattern before it quietly repeats itself once again. So perhaps the question was never why life kept forcing Daniel to start over financially, but whether he was willing to look beyond the obvious setbacks and finally see the invisible cycle that had been writing the same ending to his story all along.